As we look at the documents in the closeout phase of the job, as you can see, we've got several that would be required. The first of which, around which most of the others revolve, is the Certificate of Substantial Completion. Keep in mind that this document has several implications. From a contractual perspective, it stops the clock and confirms that the building can be used for its intended purpose. And after receiving the Certificate of Substantial Completion, the contractor can typically bill for 100% of progress payment. Let's take a look at the document in a little more detail. This is an AIA form for a Certificate of Substantial Completion. There are several different types of forms that could be used, but almost all of them are fairly simple and straightforward. Information up here relative to contract date, the contractor, name of the project, and so forth. And this is going to define the scope of work, which is substantially complete. It could be 100% or could be partial if the project is phased. This says that the work has been reviewed and inspected and is found to be in accordance with the contract documents. Most certificates of substantial completion are executed by the architect, contractor, and the owner. And that's unique because in most cases the contract for construction is executed by these two parties. But substantial completion typically requires the architect to acknowledge that that's the case. So this date of issuance then ties back to the contract and stops the clock relative to the amount of time it took to complete the project. Also, recall that issued along with the Certificate of Substantial Completion would typically be a punch list of items that need to be completed to get the project to final completion. Now let's take a look at the Certificate of Occupancy. Remember that the substantial completion document is going to be issued typically by the design team and is a contractual proposition. The Certificate of Occupancy, on the other hand, typically is issued by the city or county with jurisdiction and is issued based on life safety rather than contract scope. The document, as you can see, is pretty straightforward. This one issued by Clayton County. It lists the name of the contractor, address, the name of the project, and it's been executed by the building department as well as the fire marshal. Different counties and cities would have their own versions of the certificate. Keep in mind the certificate is very important, especially relative to project financing, utilities, and insurance, because once issued, it's no longer a construction project, but is now an occupiable building. Now let's take a look real quickly at a final pay application. We won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but understand that this is the final progress pay application and does not include retainage. As you can see, the contractor is billing for 100% of the contract value minus the retainage, while he works off the punch list and produces closeout documents. For the closeout documents, as we've talked about before, there are several things that would be delivered. We talked about warranties, for example, operation and maintenance manuals, and attic stock material. In many cases, the specifications would require certain percentages of the finished materials to be turned over, for example, extra paint, ceiling tile, or carpet, as a way for the owner to have materials to patch or repair from the same color dye lots. Moving down into major documents that would be required to complete the job, let's take a look at the contractor's Affidavit of Release of Lien. This single-page document is pretty simple and straightforward, but the language in it, where a contractor releases its right to file for lien, is very important. Let's take a closer look. This Affidavit of Release of Liens was produced by the AIA, but again, you would use whatever document was required by the owner. In this example, the owner, again a public institution, here's the project name, and so forth. The language says that the undersigned, and that's the contractor in this case, releases and waives lien rights to include the contractor, all subcontractors and suppliers that might have performed work on the project. So a very significant document for the owner, and is effective only when the contractor receives the last dollar. This example has been executed by the contractor and has also been appropriately notarized. So as you can see, fairly straightforward and simple document, but very important. Now let's take a look at the Affidavit of Payments of Debts and Claims. Another single page, very straightforward document, but is different from, yet related to, the Affidavit of Release of Liens. Let's look at it in more detail. This document is the contractor's affidavit that he has made all appropriate payment of debts and claims to those who provided labor or material on the project. Here we see this contractor has submitted it to the owner for a project on a public university campus and certifies to the best of his knowledge that all payments have been made in full and obligations satisfied for all materials and equipment furnished. There's a place for exceptions here, but typically you would see NA listed there with no exceptions. But in this example, for some reason, the general contractor still is holding retainage on two subcontractors, maybe as they wrap up some of their final work. It's executed here by the contractor and appropriately notarized. So another simple and straightforward document, but one that represents all payments being made and would be required before the contractor receives retainage. And the last of these major documents in the closeout process is the consent of surety to final payment. Let's take a look at this in more detail. This document, unlike the affidavits, is executed by the surety and is acknowledging that the owner is about to give the last dollar to the contractor. Because the contractor and the surety basically went into business together on the project, then, as you might imagine, it's important for the surety to confirm that they're aware that the last dollar is about to be given to the contractor. One thing to note is this term final payment. This is not to be confused with final progress payment, but instead this speaks to retainage dollars. A very straightforward single-page document. Here it lists the contractor, the owner, and then as you can see, the surety has executed it. In this case, by someone who's been given power of attorney by the surety, and the document has also been properly attested. Now let's look at the certificate of final completion. One thing to note, there are several families of documents, the AIA for example, that do not acknowledge a final completion document. Instead, in the general conditions, they basically just define a list of things that has to be done to achieve final completion. So you won't always see this document, particularly if AIA documents were used on the project. Let's take a closer look at this example. The document is very straightforward, again, a single page. And what it confirms is that since the certificate of substantial completion was issued, all of those things that needed to be done or corrected have been confirmed. And now the project is 100% complete. As far as the form itself, it lists the project, contract date, name of the parties, and so forth. And as you can see, similar to the certificate of substantial completion, this document has been executed by the contractor, the architect, and the owner. And so now by having this document executed, this would allow the contractor to bill for retainage. Now let's take a look at that pay application for retainage. This is pretty straightforward, but I'll show you the nuances of why it's different than a regular pay app. Let's take a closer look. As you can see, this is the same type of pay application that we saw earlier. In many ways, the retainage pay application looks very similar to the final progress billing, in that everything has been billed 100%. What's different is in the recap of the contract dollars, where normally the contractor would reduce the amount of money owed by the retainage, but as you can see, this now shows $0. Once these figures have been reconciled, then the balance due represents retainage. Remember, this payment would only be made once all work was complete and all closeout documentation received by the owner.